And it's always good to see you guys. It's been a week or so. We took a week off. And it's also good to get back into the Word to find out what we can glean and learn in our studies. And so just to kind of recap where we left off, Paul himself was delivered before Felix, and then therefore Felix had been taken from his jurisdiction, and then Festus was put in. Okay, it was under Felix that Paul had to basically play his trump card and appeal to Caesar. Okay, and then when Felix came in, he wanted to hear the case along with King Agrippa II. And if you remember, King Agrippa stated after hearing Paul's defense how that Paul would have been set at liberty had he not appealed to Caesar. Okay. However, from Acts chapter 23, Christ had already told Paul that you are going to go to Rome and you are going to go before Caesar and testify before me. Okay. And King Agrippa, upon hearing Paul's defense, had stated that he was himself almost persuaded to become a Christian at that time, okay, based on what Paul was saying, because of what he made, what Paul spoke about made sense, because King Agrippa was very familiar with the Old Testament and the prophets, okay. And so in chapter 27, we're about to start here, and it also states in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25, how that Paul states that 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day I was adrift at sea. Okay, so this is where Paul is basically en route to Rome by ship. Now, if we were to read this chapter as it is, and it's an interesting story of Paul's account and the troubles that he will incur at sea and the shipwreck that will soon follow here in this chapter. However, I believe that God has a lot more in store for us to glean from this chapter. I believe that there is so much packed within this chapter that we can pull from in our Christian walk, our Christian life. I also believe that this is a summary of our walk in trials, a summary of our life in troubled waters, our life in this earth age, in this generation, in the flood of lies that we have today. So hopefully you'll be able to glean and find some of those things that will help you understand, and also that we could all grow together and to pull out some of those that the Lord wishes us to learn from. Okay. And so I'm excited to do this chapter. I hope that you will enjoy it and find something that will help you along the way here. So again, chapter 27, the book of Acts. Paul is about to sail to Rome. Again, Christ had told him in Acts chapter 23, verse 11, that you will and must testify before Caesar himself. Okay. With that being said, Acts 27, verse 1, and when it was decided that we, and you should take note of the we that's mentioned throughout this chapter, and that's to be understood that Luke was with him, that we should sail for Italy. They delivered Paul and some of the prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, in other words, this ship would be on its return voyage. That would be its base station there, or port, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia. We, again, being Luke um, as well as accompanied by Aristarchus. In other words, these were companions in travel, uh, as Paul was allowed servants here. Aristarchus would be mentioned in Acts chapter 19 during the Ephesus riot, where how he was dragged during that riot as well. Okay, and so Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. 3. The next day, we put in at Sidon, meaning that they left Caesarea, came to Sidon, being that this would be a port of Phoenicia. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and to be cared for. And you'll see that as time goes, that this centurion, Julius, will grow very fond and go to learn to take his advice and treat him very well in this voyage here. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus. That's not to be understood that they sailed below the island of Cyprus, but that this would be a nautical term used, that they would pull the ship in such a way that they would use the island itself as a barrier or protection from the stormy winds, the waves. And so Cyprus, again, being that Greek island from chapter 13, where Paul and Barnabas took their first missionary journey. And I think that because of the winds were against us, I think this would be probably one of the things that we could use as our first lesson in this chapter, being that using Christian tack in our life, hopefully that in such a way that it would be received by others. Okay, and so they are basically sailing between Cyprus and the coastline there. Okay, and when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria, being that this would be the principal seaport of Egypt. Alexandria having been up in the northern Egypt, but also was founded by Alexander the Great there. And that would be its base home port, being that this was a ship used for carrying grain for trade to Rome in the ancient world. And so sailing for Italy and put us on aboard. And we sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off of Cnidus, and as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete of Salome. And coasting along with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, which was near the city of Lasea. Verse 9, and since much time had passed, the voyage was now dangerous because of the fast, being that this would be the fast of the Day of Atonement, putting us about October 1st or thereafter. Again, you have a indication here of the solar calendar being, but you would start in March on the spring equinox, and then on the 7th day of the 10th, the 10th day of the 7th month would put you about this time of October here. And it was already over, and Paul advised them. In other words, he's about to advise them because the winter winds are about to occur. And verse 10 saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only to the cargo and the ship, but also to our lives. Okay. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, the harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, to spend the winter there. In other words, they came upon this Fair Havens port. Not a lot going on there. It would be just kind of a boring ho-hum experience at this port. So they thought they would go a little bit further up the coast so they could go to the Liberty Town, where there might be bars and so forth for the sailors. A little bit more going on there besides a post office and a mailbox there. Okay. And so verse 13, and now when the south wind grew or blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, in other words, it looked like nice skies, it looked like everything was set, it looked like they had a good shot at this, they weighed the anchor, they picked it up and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind, this would be a typhoon in the Greek, called the northeaster, the Euroclydon, as the King James states, or in the Greek, the Euraquilo, struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught, in other words, it was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave away to it and were driven along. In other words, they were seized off course by this wind. 16. Running under the lee of a small island called Claudia, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. And this would be what you would see as a small rowboat. Normally that would be followed behind. It would be towed behind a ship in good weather and normally used for going ashore. Okay, but because of the weather and the waves that they're experiencing, it's potentially going to damage the stern of the ship, or worse, tip over and fill up with water and be acting as some type of anchor and pulling the ship which direction it may. Okay, so verse 17, after hoisting it up, they use supports to gird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear. In other words, they lowered the sail, and thus they were driven along. Okay, and so this undergirding that they basically would do is they would take ropes, heavy cords or ropes, and they would run the frapping around to the bottom of the keel all the way up to the side, up to the top. And they would basically tighten the planks, keep everything tight there to cinch up the wood in the violent storms there, okay, which might remind you of a belt, also from Ephesians chapter 6. And there's times that, you must tighten that belt on doctrine or in your life, and whichever it may be as well, okay. And so since we were violently driven or violently storm tossed, in other words, the storms of life that Christ spoke about in Matthew chapter 7, verse 25, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. Okay. Very reminiscent of the experience of the book of Jonah, who ran away from God, and they had to throw him over the side as well. And so, in other words, there's times in your life that you've got to jettison the cargo. Paul would teach from Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, stating that let us offload or cast away the burdens that so easily beset us and finish the race. Okay. Christ would also teach from Matthew chapter 19, verse 24, concerning the camel that would have a pack on its back, that in order for the camel to go through the needle gate, which is a side gate that they would shut down at night, rather than keeping the main gate open, that the camel would have to offload its cargo so that it could crouch and go up through the needle gate. So the opposite of that would be don't overload your donkey, as they say. All right. And on the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands, and it took action, it took work on their part, and that would be a good start personally. However, this is an indication that for us that we should not only rely on our own hands, but basically we should look to Christ, who sits at the right hand of God. Okay. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of being saved was last abandoned. Okay. And so with the sun and the stars in the darkness that they have there, they had lost the capability of navigating. Okay. They didn't have compasses at this time. All right. And so, in relying on man himself, on their own hands, every man is at his best state, altogether as vanity, as Psalms 39 verse 5 states. Okay. Even in the Old Testament, if you were under the law, every priest would stand daily ministering the service of sacrifice repeatedly, and yet the same sacrifices could never take away the sins. All right, from Hebrews chapter 10 verse 11. And so, I want to take this approach on both ends of the spectrum when it concerns that neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days. Okay, because oftentimes, or maybe a few times, hopefully, it might have occurred in your life. It's happened in my life. Hands up. On the one hand of the spectrum, it can get so bad, or at least mentally or spiritually in your own life, that, as it states in Psalms 38 verse 9, that my heart panteth, or it throbs, and that my strength fails me. And as for the light of mine eyes, it is gone from me. Okay. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, that we may have at least experienced that in part. But that being the far left end of the spectrum, but if we take it to the far right end of the spectrum, there will come a time as well that the sun nor the stars will be appeared, and the sun and the air will be darkened, from Revelation chapter 9 verse 2. Okay. That 150-day period mentioned in Revelation 9. All right. So something to consider there. And verse 21. And since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me, and have not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss." And unfortunately, there are some that still reject or teach against Paul. Okay. 22. And yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. And so, being that the book of James chapter 3 verse 4 and 5 indicates that, as an analogy, that our bodies are as a ship. All right. And I think that the deeper meaning here would be that, you know, spiritually, the ship representing our vessel in which our souls dwell, meaning our flesh bodies, there will be that change, but it will our bodies will be transfigured, as Paul taught in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 there, if you've listened to him. Okay. And so again, there will be no loss of life, but only of the ship. And I think that's something that we should look at in the deeper sense, meaning our spirit, our flesh bodies. And so verse 23, for this night stood there before me an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. Okay. Again, one of the same charges that Christ makes toward us in Mark chapter 13, verse 9, when we were to be delivered up before the false Christ there. It's the overlay that's there for us to see and read for ourselves. Again, Mark 13, verse 29. And behold, God has granted to you all who sail with you. Verse 25, so take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be delivered exactly as I have been told. And so God always provides that way out, as it states in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 there. 26, but we must run aground on some island. And when the 14th night had come, and as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing new land. Okay. And so 14 in biblical numerics, you see the pattern throughout the scriptures there, where 14 would come to represent deliverance. 7 being spiritual completeness doubled, 7 plus 7. It would be that God delivered Israel on the 14th day at evening, from Exodus chapter 12, verse 6. But also about midnight, it should call in your mind the midnight cry from Matthew chapter 25, verse 6. And so we know that when that midnight cry, that we too will be nearing new land. In other words, we go to that new Jerusalem. Verse 28, and so they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. And so a fathom representing about 6 feet. And so 20 fathoms would be 120 feet. And a little farther, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. So they were approaching ground fast, here it being about 90 feet. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for the day to come. And I think what we can see here within this is that 4 representing earth, and the listed as the 4 corners of the earth there from Revelation chapter 7, verse 1, being the 4 points of the compass. Also indicated from Isaiah chapter 11, verse 12. In other words, they let down these 4 anchors to seeking to get a grip on life, and in which Paul would speak to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 19 through 20, stating, holding faith and a good conscience, some having put away concerning faith have made shipwreck. Okay. And so being that they would look for the day to come, again, that day being the Lord's day. Verse 30, and as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, that they had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense, and laying out the anchors from the ship's boat into the sea, or under pretense, laying the anchors from the bow. Okay. And so that would be from the time that they put it on the boat there from verse 16 and 17. In other words, they wanted to escape off of this ship here. Unfortunately, many today have beliefs that they want to escape as well. In verse 31, and Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, and mind you, it's loud, it's noisy, there's waves, there's wind, so I'm sure he yelled this out and had a very strong indication, emphatically stating, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Okay. Likewise for us today, I believe that we are to board the ark of the end times from Matthew chapter 24, verse 38. All right. Verse 32, then these soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship and ship's boat and let it go. And so, this boat had been on board long enough. Okay. It's been a problem since day one. It's been their security blanket from verse 16 and 17, that from the time that they put it on, it's been nothing but headache and trouble. And so being that the soldiers cut away the ropes, snip, John chapter 15, snipping whatever it may be. Sometimes you have to cut away people from your life, or else the problem will continue on to drag down other people, whether it be sin or whatever it is, which does not produce any fruit. Okay. And so, and as day was about to dawn, Paul urged them to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day, and you have continued in suspense without food, having taken nothing. Verse 34, therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, or spiritual strength, for the final push to overcome this age. For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And that should remind you there from Luke chapter 21, verse 18. And when he had said these things, he took bread, or the bread of life, and giving thanks to God in presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. And then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. Verse 37, we were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. And so I found an interesting verse here from Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 1, stating, as far as throwing out the wheat into the sea, it states that to cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. Okay. And so verse 39, now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, and which they had planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. And so they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, and at the same time loosened the ropes and tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. Okay. And so for ourselves today, hoisting the foresail being the standard from Isaiah chapter 62, verse 10. Verse 41, but striking a reef, I couldn't help think about Jude, the book of Jude, verse 12, concerning those spots. And they ran the vessel aground, and the bow struck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broke up by the surf. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners unless they should swim away and escape. In other words, they had run upon this reef or this sandbank, a spot between two seas. And so it was the soldiers' responsibility to ensure that they had gotten to Rome as well as Paul. And so verse 43, but the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. And he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard and to make for the land. And same true for us today, to swim, jump, kick, pull, yank, whatever you got to do to make it. All right. And if you fall forward, never backwards. And to complete the chapter, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. Okay. Again, I believe that there is a great lesson for us in this generation, a good summary of our lives in this age, how that we will go through those trials. Christ never promised that it would be easy. You know, Matthew chapter 24, verse 21 through 22, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 26 through 29, that there would come a great shaking if you were not on the foundation, that you would fall. However, he did say and promise many times that he would provide a way, or a way through, as it states in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13 there. So a really fascinating chapter. I think if you just read this chapter on its own, it might seem just like an interesting journey. But however, if you start to overlay the spiritual aspects to this, such as that towboat that they were dragging along the whole entire journey, ended up becoming a problem for them. And so that towboat would seem to be representative of sin or people, whatever the means of that was, a security blanket. And it was better for them to snip it, to cut it, and get it away from them, that they would be pulled, and to rely on what Paul had stated, which would ultimately come from what God had stated, in as much as he would be promised that he would go to Rome. And so Paul never lost that faith, even though things did look bad. And so beautiful chapter, probably one of the most fascinating chapters I think that we've come across in a long time. I really enjoyed this study, putting it together. And so I hope that you enjoyed it. One chapter left. We'll finish the book of Acts. And so we will continue on. God bless. See you next week. All right.